Hi everyone, we've got a very special extended interview for you here on YouTube with Tom McTague.
It was an absolutely fascinating conversation with Tom. I think we talked about it afterwards and described it as possibly the scariest interview we've ever done, because this is a man that's been close to Starmer and we think has sympathy to him, has affection maybe even for him. And even he speaks to, dare I say, a lack of confidence in a Labour message, and with grave consequences for the public.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a real sense that there are things that the Labour government is doing at the moment that are not being communicated properly, and there are other things that the Labour government is doing that are misdirected because of a lack of an overall vision for the country. That's certainly how I felt listening to Tom talk about Starmer and how I felt reading his article about Starmer. And the threat is severe. It's the prospect of the hard right. But listen, please, this was a fascinating conversation. Have a listen, have a watch of it right now and enjoy. Enjoy may not be the right word. Nearly 1 year into government, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer remains something of an enigma. He's seen by many on the right as a secret radical and many on the left as someone who's trying to out-reform reform.
On the world stage, his reviews are positive. He's nailed down trade deals with leaders from all around the world. He's garnered praise as a diplomat and a peacemaker for his role in tempering Trump. But domestically, voters aren't all too convinced about his leadership. He promises change and respect for working people, but the public aren't buying it. Polls are in the toilet after upsetting the country multiple times over his dour telling of the economic situation, his island of strangers speech, and his government's sweeping reforms to benefits, to name just a few.
But realistically, we are 4 years away from the next election. So actually the polls are the least of Starmer's concerns. The tension is ratcheting up as the fires of war burn in the Middle East, the global economic outlook remains grim, and there are backbench rebellions brewing. All while the false promises of the populist right win over the public. It is clear that right now the UK is in desperate need of unifying leadership.
The new editor of the new Statesman, Tom McTague, has spent weeks following the Prime Minister to try and figure this out, and he joins us now. Welcome to Pod Save the UK, Tom.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So, Tom, you've been following the Prime Minister across land, sea and air. The journey involves quite a spicy trip in an overnight aircraft carrier. There's a helicopter ride in a special rubber jumpsuit. And that's not a euphemism, and that is actually what it is. And a quiet beer that neither of you really wanted. So what did you learn from these strange encounters?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, I remember going through these series of trips with him, 4 in total, and thinking to myself, God, am I getting anywhere with him? You know, am I managing to peel any of those layers off so that I can sort of find something real, something true, something that the country out there doesn't already know? And feeling that pressure of the, you know, a profile that I felt before when I've covered other prime ministers, but with Keir, it's not as if the outward personality is there is much to write about there, that you've got, I once covered Boris Johnson, and you could at least write about the kind of flamboyant character, and that would get you through a few pages before you kind of dug in and got the real Boris Johnson. But with Keir, I think what I found was when he was sort of switched on, and in the middle of the day, maybe he'd spoken to another journalist before, or he'd been on the Today program, or he'd been on a podcast. He was so on that you couldn't penetrate, you couldn't get anywhere with him. He'd just give you the same sort of answers that he'd give to anyone. And it was only really when you kind of got him out of that world, when you maybe talked to him at the end of the day or over a beer, as you say, that neither of us wanted, and you were able to sort of ask him about something that was nothing to do with politics, about his family or the way he was brought up or the way he thinks about the world, that's when you started to get somewhere, I think. And with him, I think it's ultimately the sense that I got was he's a man who sees himself as a very normal man who tries to address individual problems in what he would see as a kind of normal and decent manner, engaging with people on a one-to-one basis and trying to fix their problems in a way that he has always done throughout his career, as if he's kind of prosecuting an individual case in court. But then when you try to get him to think about things sort of beyond that, systemically, structurally, why is it that we have all of these cases? Why is it that the country feels the way it does, the way that you two you described at the beginning there, that's when I think he struggles. And I to some extent, I'm not even sure he does think in those sort of grander systemic terms. He just prefers to look at everything individually.
It's quite fascinating. Myself, I've done a few profiles in my time. It doesn't tend to be like leaders of Western nations. It tends to be more like pop stars and artists. But even so, that sense of getting close to someone who's of public interest and trying to break down that iciness. When I was reading it, I had that sort of head on. I kept thinking to myself, God, you used the word impenetrable there. He came across as quite guarded, despite you having all these quite emotive opportunities, even just being up high in the air and a twinge of fear of heights or anything like that. I didn't get that sense. You got rather you painted this quite strong picture of a man who at times was giving you nothing. And I kept reflecting on that afterwards, wondering, is guarded the way that he is in terms of public criticism as well? Rather, I know you were saying that there's a lack of kind of blue sky thinking, and I would want to get into that more shortly. But also, he must have heard the uproar that has been coming from the public. It's been so loud, from everything from pension to winter fuel cuts to God no Island of Strangers. Do you think he hears that stuff? Do you think he is honestly guarded from just all criticism, all noise?
No. I think he absolutely hears it. I mean, there is a moment towards the end of the profile where I'm with him in Glasgow and I ask him about the Island of Strangers speech. And you can tell very clearly that he kind of regrets it. He regrets certainly the response, the focus on the Island of Strangers bit of the speech when he is like, essentially, look, I accept, it's on me. It's my fault that, if the emphasis that I wanted hasn't come through in the coverage. And he just looks a bit sort of downcast about that, and that he wanted to emphasize the kind of what he sees as the progressive bits of the speech, that we are all walking together as one country, I think, as he put it to me. But actually, in some senses, Starmer is both guarded and quite open, so again, mentioning Boris Johnson, what you got is the kind of diversion tactics. You got the flamboyant exterior that was almost like a cover that stopped you entering and getting anything interesting from what he really felt. And you had to push and push and push and push until eventually you got something serious from him. And it was in that moment of the seriousness that you got something with Johnson. With Starmer, it was the other way around. It was that there is this kind of sort of dry exterior, this sort of earnest, sort of on a personal level, very nice man who will ask you about your family and talk about normal things, football and these kind of things. But it didn't take much, actually, for suddenly to see the kind of vulnerability, in a sense. So when I asked him about his family, in particular his brother who died quite recently, he became very, very emotional very quickly. So tears in his eyes, unable really to speak about it without getting more upset, sort of looking quite lost and forlorn. And then when I asked him about the Island of Strangers speech, as I say, it was quite open. His emotion was quite open about that. It was almost like a sadness that he hadn't quite been able to express himself. And I think that is the key thing that in a sense that I took away from him, that the emotion is much closer to the surface than I had expected and appreciated. But his inability to express himself and to express his feelings and to articulate his thoughts about the country, about politics, about himself, about what he is trying to express. And that repeated sense of disappointment that he can't do it. So he says to me at one point about his brother, I never wanted to speak about him.
It was a really touching bit, that, I have to say. I was really moved by it.
Yeah, when I listened back to the tape of my conversation with him, I did for a moment think, God, I was sat in a room with the Prime Minister and he was basically crying on me because he was upset about his brother. What a weird experience to have. But he was, just for listeners, his brother was a very vulnerable man, born, Keir Starmer says, he didn't have learning difficulties, had difficulties learning. But I think they were, severe difficulties in learning. So he was very vulnerable, and Keir Starmer felt a responsibility to look after him throughout his life. And then he died from cancer when he was 60, I think, on Boxing Day last year. And it's still very raw for Starmer. But he says things to me like, I wanted to speak about him, but I never could because I couldn't find a way of being able to talk about him in a way that didn't feel like I was abusing him, using him in some way for politics. And he says, I can't explain it. I understood what he was saying, but he was saying, I can't explain it. I can't explain it. And I thought, that's what you hear a lot. He can't explain it. He regrets the way he said something. And I think ultimately this is the challenge, the political challenge that you both mentioned in the opening, in that the country feels raw and angry and upset, worried, all of these emotions, different types of emotions that it's feeling after what has been a pretty grim period in British national life over the last 20 years. And he both doesn't really engage in the deeper reasons for that, and he struggles to articulate those sort of feelings that the country has.
So, separate from our domestic troubles, as we record on Tuesday morning, the very real prospect of all-out war in the Middle East is dominating the news. So on Friday, Israel launched a surprise attack on Iran, followed by days of escalating strikes on both sides, with numerous people killed and hundreds more injured. Starmer has refused to rule out defending Israel and is sending jets to the Middle East, when a week ago the government was actually sanctioning ministers from the Israeli government. We talked a little bit about how he struggles maybe to articulate his vision for the country and the United Kingdom, and how he's struggling to get that across. In terms of his foreign policy philosophy, what's your perspective on that, Tom? Because he's in the last sort of 10 days, he's gone from saying we have to sanction Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir to now saying Israel has a right to defend itself, and essentially sort of providing soft justification for the Israeli actions in Iran. What do you get a sense of what his actual foreign policy doctrine is?
I think this is a fascinating question, because it comes back ultimately to a sense that you get from him, and you have to push him quite hard on this before you get the real answer. But it is essentially one of conservation. It's a conservation of most of the status quo is what Keir Starmer believes in. And I remember pushing him on this because I was part of the profile was giving him the chance to sort of tell the country what he is trying to do in power, because that is one of the criticisms of this government, that we're a year in, as you say, and in one sense, we don't know what they're trying to do. What's the big picture here? What is it that they think is principally gone wrong in the country and the world? And therefore, what is it trying to do principally, this fundamental core, what is it trying to do to fix that? And I don't think the country is that clear about those questions. And then I pushed him on this and I pushed him on it. And ultimately, he didn't have clear answers until I got to the point where I said, you don't think the country is fundamentally broken. You don't think the model of the country is broken. You just think it's been let down by a series of bad prime ministers who have effectively managed the situation badly. And he replied, yeah, you're right. That's what he believes at his core, that, post 2008 and the financial crisis, or post 2003, the Iraq war, and all of the wars that have happened since, there isn't anything fundamentally wrong with the system that we have, whether domestic or international, that needs to be upended. And so what he says is that he wants to mend it, to sort of fix it through sensible decisions, individual decisions. So whether that's the economy in Britain doesn't need to be fundamentally changed. Public services, there's nothing wrong with the essential models that we have for the NHS, for schools, etc. And then internationally, he wants to bind the United States into NATO and Europe's defense. He doesn't want to use Donald Trump as a sort of a moment to realize some kind of different foreign policy. And I think once you start to think about Starmer in that kind of small c conservative way, a lot of it becomes clear what's going on. So in Israel, the position that he is taking is the position that every British government has taken basically forever, which is increasing criticism, in relation to sort of certain actions that Israel has taken, whether it's in Gaza or Lebanon. If you go back to Tony Blair, he found himself in trouble in 2006-07 because of his response to the Israel's war in Lebanon. But ultimately, it's this same phrase that Israel has the right to defend itself. They are a core ally of the United Kingdom and the Western world, and we will defend it. And that is what basically Starmer believes. He doesn't want to upend anything about Britain's place in the world, NATO, the G7, relations with Europe, relations with the United States. And I think that lies at the core of how he's responding to this crisis.
Is that not a fundamental failing of him as a politician in some ways? Because if you look at the 21st century, the global order is sort of collapsing as these kind of despots rise, whether it's Orban, Putin, or Netanyahu, these people sort of almost openly hostile to the concept of liberal democracy start rising to positions of power. We have the US and the UK engaged in regime change driven wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That, you know, there's so much blood has been spilled in Afghanistan, and the status quo at the start of the century has been maintained. The Taliban is in charge of that country. Plus, with the sort of post-2008 economic systems have shown that kind of third way model of public spending through tax receipts generated by light to no regulation of the financial sector isn't sufficient to manage these kind of supranational mega corporations. Is Starmer's reading of the situation not fundamentally the key problem with him as a politician in this exact time? He would have been a phenomenal leader of the Labour Party in 1997. He would have been a phenomenal prime minister of this country in 1997, much as I wish it was still 1997, because I'd be, 12 years old and have hope in my eyes and considerably less grey hair. That's wishing that was so is not going to make it the case. Have you not highlighted the fundamental problem with him as a politician?
Well, look, I think that is essentially one of the central questions in the profile. And it's an attempt in this profile to look at both Starmer, the man, as he is in his day-to-day life, as he governs the country, as he deals with the balance between work and family life, how he is as a person, how he is just in general, how he is to work with, all of that, that's what I want to get at in this profile, but also that fundamental question, as you've just very clearly articulated, which lies at the heart, I think, of this government and the judgment that it's making, why it's unpopular, and why the country feels so kind of fractious and on edge. And that is this central question of, are we trying to maintain a system that is gone, that is broken, that is not coming back, can't come back? You cannot go back to a world pre-2007-8 where we could take the tax receipts from the City of London and redistribute them around the country in public spending. And that was the central political compromise that the entire sort of basis of Blairism, which Cameron tried to maintain in some form, is gone. It's never coming back. You can't do it. The City of London is no longer what it was compared to 2006. It no longer feels in any sense like the world's financial capital. That's just somewhere else now, whether it's obviously New York or increasingly in the Middle East. But also the foreign policy. The foreign policy is gone. I say in the piece, in 1997, the British economy was bigger than China's economy and India's economy combined. Today, China's economy is something like 7 times bigger than Britain's alone, and India's is bigger as well. That this is a world in which we are just a different country to what we were in 97. And that sense of Starmer as a much less powerful figure on the world stage, almost, and this is a question I kind of put in the profile. One way of thinking about him, is he the first normal prime minister we have? He could be the prime minister of any country in Europe, normal, centrist, suited man who manages a mid-sized country. And perhaps that's what he is. He's like the first one to not try to look back to some great power days, and all of those prime ministers who had tried to go back to that world have just failed, Tony Blair and Boris Johnson or even Liz Truss, explodes in their face. Or is he this is a more sort of worrying question, I guess. Is he the last normal prime minister, the last one of a kind of failing order, the one who is understandable to us in 1997 terms, the one who sort of still believes in that world? And when he fails, because he has fundamentally got that question wrong, that it's not possible to recreate that order or to save it or to mend it in any sense. If he gets that wrong, then there'll be somebody coming in next who will blow it up because they don't believe in it. And that's the kind of thing, the kind of spectre I think that hangs over my profile, which is if the latter analysis is right, then we can see who's coming. We can see that it's Nigel Farage or, let's say, Robert Jenrick and the Conservative Party. And they're quite clear, aren't they, that the current system has failed. And now we can be very critical from the left and say, oh, do you actually think that, or are you just going to bring back a kind of form of hyper globalization and free market capitalism and all of that? But on other questions like the European Court of Human Rights and those kind of questions, they're very clear, aren't they? It's just tear it up, leave. It's gone. It's broken. And that's, I think, the fundamental question here with Keir Starmer.
Gosh, I mean, that idea of him being the first normal prime minister is really fascinating. And there's a part of me that's like, well, maybe he's the prime minister that we deserve in a way, in the sense that, you know, we are a nation. I don't want to use the word in decline because that sounds much more negative than I sort of feel about Britain, but like we're no longer projecting the global power that we are. And so that maybe perhaps he's like the honest prime minister, you know, he is who we actually are now. But I just can't imagine that being very popular with the public. I mean, just on that question about a normal prime minister, do you think Britain, with all our history and our long legacy and our time as a colonial superpower, really, do you think we would ever accept a prime minister like one they might have in Denmark, one who cycles around? You know, do you think that we're ready for that?
Look, it's a good question because, you know, there are other countries who have been, you know, imperial powers like the Dutch who are, you know, accept that status quite happily and are extremely rich compared to us. So maybe that is the future that we need to work towards, to be normal again. Let's make Britain normal again. But there is if you sort of think about how he responds to these crises, it's not like he's entirely one way or the other when I say that he's the first normal prime minister. If you think about how he's responding in Ukraine, he essentially thinks that, you know, we are a really important player. We are going to take special measures compared to most other European countries. It's going to be Britain and France in the lead, providing a reassuring defense force of some description. This is not him saying, no, we'll just be like, you know, Denmark or Holland. We'll just sort of fall in behind everybody else. He still wants that same position. So in a sense, he's a sort of continuity figure. He's not trying to change Britain's position in any fundamental way. Again, if you think about the current conflict in Israel and Iran, Britain has sent military equipment to the Middle East in case that we need to do what we did earlier on when we take down these Iranian missiles that are coming towards Israel. So there is still there's still an ambiguity about him. But in some senses, if you think about the negotiations with the European Union, he handled those in a completely different way to almost all of his predecessors. And there's a rival podcast, perhaps I shouldn't mention it, but Ed Balls and George Osborne, who were talking about this, and they were both saying, oh, I don't think he was very political in that. What you should do in a negotiation with Europe is you need to set out a kind of a fight that you're willing to have with them, that you know that you can fundamentally win. So you set out a red line and you fight them and you hold your own, and then you declare victory over the dastardly Europeans, and then you sort of come home as the great victor. And that's the Margaret Thatcher handbagging her way to the rebate success. And if you go through the newspapers, that is exactly what Tony Blair did, exactly what John Major did, exactly what Gordon Brown and David Cameron and all of the others did, and look where it got them. Right? They kept, particularly towards the end, they tried that technique and they kept getting smashed over the head and not really coming back with anything. And then we ended up where we did. Keir Starmer says to his Europe negotiator, "I don't want anything in the newspapers. I don't want any red lines. I don't want any fights. I just want you to quietly get on with it and come back with a deal." And what happens? That's what happened. They came back. They got a deal. There was a couple of days of bad headlines in the conservative press, and it was signed. And interestingly, the country appears to support that deal as a kind of just, oh right, so we got we don't have to queue up through passport gates in Malaga. Great. Okay, fine. I don't really care about all the other details. So maybe he's onto something in that regard. Maybe the days of having massive fights with the European Union are over, because the country is quite realistic about British power negotiating with the European Union. Maybe the country is quite realistic about British power negotiating with Donald Trump's United States. Maybe we just accept, all right, we've got 10% tariffs, fine, we'll take that. It's better than 26%. We haven't got a special relationship. We're not going to war with Russia. Of course, we're not going to war with Russia. All of these things, maybe that is the direction of travel. And he is a kind of bridging prime minister on the way to that future. But I still think it comes back to that more worrying question about whether there is something quite different coming next if he is unable to show that the current system as it stands is capable of being fixed.
If I was George Osborne and had been involved with the Cameron era negotiations of the European Union, I would not opine on that particular subject. It's like avoiding iceberg lessons from the captain of the Titanic. But the sort of constant spectre through all of this is the threat of the far right and how Starmer is trying to manage that. And a huge news story over the weekend that happened here was a very politically loaded backflip that various people observing the situation might say is an attempt that Starmer is making to head off criticism from the hard right. So it involves Baroness Louise Casey's review into child sex abuse gangs, which recommended a full national inquiry, a recommendation that the government has accepted. So previously, Starmer has argued that the issue had already been examined in a 7-year inquiry, and the best action was to action the recommendations of that inquiry that had been sat on by the previous government. And Starmer had, in fact, sort of been very, very critical of politicians that he perceived were pandering to the far right by demanding another inquiry. Casey's review highlighted critical failings in the collection of data around ethnicity of offenders, and that has been one of the driving forces behind her recommendation of a national inquiry.
So when announcing her findings, Casey said that instead of examining whether there is disproportionality in ethnicity or cultural factors at play in certain types of offending, we found many examples of organisations avoiding the topic altogether for fear of appearing racist, raising community tensions, or causing community cohesion problems. She also noted that the system claims there is an overwhelming problem with white perpetrators when that can't be proved due to the lack of collection of the ethnicity of the offenders.
It's so important to note in the middle of all of this conversation that Richard Fuchs is the director of Hydrant, who did a kind of massive investigation into this, said that the offenders broadly reflect the ethnic mix of the UK population, and that in general terms, what we see across all group-based offending is that no particular ethnicity stands out based on population data. Now, despite all of that, there's been a huge amount of frothing at the mouth from the usual suspects around this and demanding a sort of new inquiry. And Elon Musk picked up on it earlier this year. So, Tom, what's your read on why Starmer has changed his tune on this particular subject and gone from saying that politicians demanding a new inquiry were pandering to the hard right to actually now suggesting that there will be a follow-up inquiry?
I mean, he had no choice. You cannot have Baroness Casey coming back with such stark findings and to then ignore the sort of central recommendation in her report. I mean, I think fundamentally this goes to the heart of a problem that Starmer has, and it's a repeating problem for him, or a mistake that he makes. He is now having a reputation for U-turning on decisions that he has made, whether it's winter fuel, or on this. It's a thing that's starting to be picked up by the press, by the public, by his own MPs. And I think the problem that I have with this is that I've spoken to people very close to Keir Starmer months ago, and they spoke in powerful, emotional terms about the sort of trauma of what happened to these girls and the failures of the system. And they were totally aware of how scandalous it was and the failures of Labour councils in many ways over time. And they would have been telling the Prime Minister this. And he has got himself into a position where he had just, dismissed this as pandering to the far right. He should have known that he's going to have to U-turn on this. And yet he's been 9 months, in the making. It just seems, even if you put aside questions of sort of morality on this, it's just politically absurd what he has done. And I think it comes back to another fundamental problem, I think, that he has. He increasingly relies on other people to create a cover for his own changes of direction. So again, you could say about on gender with the Supreme Court ruling. We don't know what he really thinks about it. We just know that it wasn't until the courts changed the guidance that he changed. So it's not that he's like leading on a moral question. I mean, he could change the law if he doesn't agree with the Supreme Court. He could change the law and say, no, I don't agree with this, actually. And I'm the Prime Minister and I'm going to take a moral stance and lead on this. Or he could say that about grooming gangs. He could have led the way in either direction. He could make a compelling case, but he waits until somebody like Louise Casey comes back and says, this is what you have to do. And he says, okay, we'll do what Louise Casey says, or we'll do what the Supreme Court says. The other example is the Chagos Island deals, where we don't really hear from him very much. We just hear a kind of, oh, well, the law says this, so we've had to do this. And then the public feels lost in what is it that this government stands for? And I think that is the heart of the problem here, is that we're not really being given this clear articulation of what he thinks about any number of subjects. And so we're kind of left to fill in the gaps, and we kind of drift until somebody else intervenes, whether it's Baroness Casey or the Supreme Court or whatever it is. And so we have a kind of government by Baroness Casey. I mean, that's a kind of crazy place to be, I think.
Quite early on in the profile, you referred to this idea that he sees himself almost as kind of a manager, a sort of managerial figure in government. And so a lot of that thinking pervades everything that you said over the course of this interview, which is this idea that he doesn't see it as his job to essentially fundamentally reshape our foreign policy or our economy, or intervene on controversial issues like gender or grooming gangs. And he sees his position as deferring to specific experts in those fields.
Yeah.
But the issue here is that, I guess, even if his intent is, I believe in the primacy of expertise in all of these fields, so I defer to those people, there is obviously a danger that to the public it looks like he's someone without a fixed ideology who is using these experts to provide him political cover on issues that he's afraid to speak out on. And that's then a very dangerous position to be in, especially when you compound it with the idea that one of his skill sets might not be communication, and the confusion around how he perceives the Island of Strangers speech, and the very fact that we call it the Islands of Strangers speech, as much as that's, an issue of interpretation, that's the fault of the speaker, right? Part of the problem is that he didn't articulate the point that he was trying to make properly. This is a huge problem, but we're only a year into the Labour government, and there is this, big window of time before they have to call an election. Do you think that Starmer is capable of righting some of these fundamental problems? Because he definitely has something that most of his predecessors didn't have, which is he does have time to do this. But do you think he has the ability or the willingness to do this?
Yeah, I think that is difficult. I think given that we're only a year in, a lot of prime ministers, I think Tony Blair said that it was only basically in his third term where he understood how to actually be prime minister, and he just sort of used the levers of of state. But I think what is different is this question of articulation and articulating what you really think. And I think one of the problems is that he's trying to execute a strategy to ensure that he protects the seats that he won at the last election, many of whom have Reform candidates in second place breathing down their neck. And you have polls saying that Reform could take 250 seats off the Labour Party. And, I think the Greens could take 4 seats or something. So that's obviously like playing into his strategy, right? It's very clear that they feel that the Reform, Nigel Farage, are the chief threat to their power. They are effectively the opposition. In the entire time I spent with him over 6 weeks, he didn't mention Kemi Badenoch or the Tories hardly at all. I don't think he mentioned Kemi Badenoch once from memory, but he certainly mentioned Nigel Farage a lot. So that that tells you something. But yet, does he feel it? So does he feel these things? So when he gives the Island of Strangers speech, who's the real Keir Starmer? Is it the man who thinks in quite stark terms about, what did he call it? The kind of, the experiment, the one nation experiment in open borders that was unforgivable. I think that was his language. Yeah. Is that what he feels, really? Or does he feel what I saw in him, which was a kind of slight embarrassment at how it had been understood? And he was actually a kind of quite typical centre-left guy who, doesn't want any kind of major controversy here. He just wants to sort of manage a situation and ensure that the country feels a little bit less fraught. That's kind of what he wants. And he has concluded that the levels of migration are currently too high to be able to achieve that. And that's his argument, right? But what is it that this Prime Minister feels about these things? And let's say again on the grooming gangs, does he feel that in his bones that this is a national scandal of such proportions that it's kind of, it has to be addressed full on? Or does he feel in his bones that it's been overblown by the right for political purposes? I think the problem at the moment is I don't think the country knows the answer to that question fundamentally. And I think you could say that about lots of things. And sometimes his rhetoric, the sort of stronger rhetoric or the tweets that he makes, they don't sound authentically Keir Starmer. And so some of it isn't quite believable in that respect. And so it's not working either, because the people it's intended to reach don't believe it. And then the people who want a different type of Keir Starmer are starting to be alienated by some of that language. So I think he's facing a problem of, it's an overused word, isn't it? Authenticity, but it's that a sense of setting a direction about where he believes this country needs to go, where he thinks it's gone wrong, or where he thinks it needs to go to get better. And on that question, that's the thing that he's struggling on the most, I think.
And do you think it has to be Starmer who fills that void? Could it be Rayner? Could it be Miliband? Could it be other ministers that give you a sense of the Labour government as a whole? Or must it be Keir Starmer? Must it be the Prime Minister?
I'm really interested by that idea, because I think if he's somebody who sees himself in this kind of managerial role, surely it would benefit him to have more forward-facing ministers. He's assembled a sort of Lincoln-like team of rivals that have different perspectives that push him forward. Wouldn't it make sense to have more of those ministers be quite front-footed on individual issues? But then does that undermine his authority as Prime Minister? Wouldn't it make more sense for him to make more of someone like Angela Rayner or more of someone like Ed Miliband?
Yeah, perhaps. But again, though, I think we come back to these questions. What is it that this Labour government thinks is wrong with, say, healthcare? Or why are the waiting lists so long? Why is it that it's so difficult to get a doctor's appointment? What's wrong with education? What does it look like in 10 years' time in an ideal world? We don't know the answers to these questions. So I don't think we know what a kind of Labour education system will look like that's fundamentally different to today. At the moment, it feels like what they kind of believe is just with a bit more money and a bit more sensible government, a bit more stability, if we didn't keep removing prime ministers and doing mad things like Liz Truss, everything would basically be all right. And we'd get back to being able to see your doctor, the next day, or your children would go to school and it wouldn't, be falling down and there'd be a teacher in the classroom and that kind of thing. Then maybe they're right. Maybe that's right. That we're not fundamentally got anything majorly wrong with the country. The essential structures are fine. But on those questions, it's quite interesting to think, who are the most popular Labour shadow cabinet? Who are the most popular Labour cabinet
Fair enough.
ministers?
It's 14 years of it, isn't it? So
Yeah.
it's fair play.
Remember, Tom, Ed Miliband is in the government. He's not leader of the opposition. But, Ed Miliband is the most popular Labour minister. And why? Why is he? Right? Because he wasn't exactly a successful leader of the opposition. He's the most successful minister because I think he has quite a clear idea of what he wants and what he believes. We kind of know what Ed Miliband believes, right? He believes that the system is kind of fundamentally broken, and we need to be running much more quickly towards a net zero and a completely different energy mix. And he is out there on Twitter and on TikTok and all the rest saying what he believes. And he's not really hedging in a way that other members of the cabinet are. Ed Miliband's got a clear answer, right? And a lot of people agree with him. And so I think he carries with him this sense of purpose that people then understand. And you can take a position against, right? For or against. You can say he's wrong, he's crazy, Other people can say, well, I know where he stands and I agree with him. I totally agree with him. And I think there aren't that many in the cabinet where you have that sense of clarity. And I guess what Angela Rayner brings is a sense of authenticity, and she can articulate a position. And she's also a kind of formidable political operator behind the scenes who sort of can fight her corner. And you kind of also know who she stands for, who she's against. And that is, as an aide close to Keir Starmer put it to me in the profile, that is at the heart of politics. Who is it that you stand for? Who are you there for? And this person said to me that the problem with the Rachel Reeves winter fuel cut was that it raised that question. Oh, hang on. Well, if we're electing a Labour government that's doing that, what is it? Whose side is it on here? And so I guess that's kind of why Rayner and Miliband, two figures that you mentioned, are seen as so popular. And of course Miliband really can't become leader, so only leaves you with Rayner and a few others.
Well, it's certainly a fascinating prospect to leave this on. Tom McTague, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK.
Thanks for having me.
You can read Tom's profile of Keir Starmer, which is called What Keir Starmer Can't Say, in the New Statesman right now.